It is becoming springtime here. And of course, I know if you live in Australia and some of the other folks of you some of you listening around the world, this is not becoming springtime to you, but it is here in the United States. And at this time of the year, we have, all the things that Anthony talked about with the birds and the, flowers and everything. But it's also a special time of the year because back in the days of the Old Testament, in the Hebrew days, a very important thing happened that was extremely important to God and his people and to us today. So I wanted to talk about that. Back in those days, the Old Testament, the Israelite people had been in slavery in Egypt for over 400 years. Now think about that. The United States has been a nation for 245 years. If we go back 430 years, the year would be like in the 1500s. Think how long ago that was. How many years has it been and how much stuff has happened in the world in all that time? That's a very long time for people to not be allowed to do anything but work for the king who was called Pharaoh in Egypt all that time, your entire life and your grandfather and your great-grandparents for 400 years. And all that time, the people knew that there was a God that their ancestor Abraham had worshiped, but they really did not have any faith that he would take them out of their life of slavery. The Egyptians, where they lived, where God's people lived at the time, the Egyptians had lots of gods that they worshiped. There were things in nature around them. They worshiped the sun, they worshiped the Nile River, it watered their crops and it gave them fish to eat. The sun gave them light. So these things to them seemed like they were gods, and they worshiped animals and many other things. I can't cover all that happened in the story of how God's people were freed from slavery in the Bible, but it is super important to understand the history of God's people and his miracles, and for us Christians to understand how this affects us. So especially at this time of year, when these events happened thousands of years ago, I would really like it if you all would, for your homework, please read the book of Exodus. There's a lot in here that I'm not going to cover, but it's very interesting. God chose a man named Moses to go to Pharaoh, and I'm not going to go through the whole how that came about with Moses, but go read it. It's interesting. To go to Pharaoh and demand that he let the Israelites go. Moses did not speak well, so he asked God if somebody could help him, and God called his brother Aaron to go with him to speak to Pharaoh. So they went to see Pharaoh, and they told him to let the slaves go and worship God. He thought he'd try just a little bit. Just let us go for 3 days out in the wilderness to worship God. And we see in Exodus 5:2, Pharaoh says, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." And I didn't look it up, but I have a feeling that he's actually maybe saying Yahweh, who is the name of God told Moses his name, and it's Yahweh. And so I think Pharaoh was saying, hey, I don't know who this Yahweh is. So God brought 10 plagues on the land and the Egyptian people. There were 2 reasons for these plagues. One was to show the Israelite people that the God of their fathers was alive and that they should worship him. And the second was to show Pharaoh that all the Egyptians that their gods had no power at all. In Exodus 12:12, God says, "I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt." So let's look at the 10 plagues now, and let's see how some of these Egyptian gods were shown to have no power. The first plague was turning the water of the Nile into blood. And we read this in Exodus 7:17. It says, "Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, with the staff that is my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn to blood." Now, the Egyptians had several gods of the Nile River because they could not exist as a nation without the Nile. One of them was named Khnum. And he had they all had weird heads, like falcons and different animals and things. Not only could the people not drink the water for 3 days, but millions of fish died and they could not use the river for anything. It says in there that some of the people started digging holes on the banks of the river to just see if they could go down and get some water to drink. Then Moses told Pharaoh to let the people go, and Pharaoh again refused. He made the slaves work harder, and they weren't very happy about it, but they did not yet understand what all God had in mind. So God caused a plague of frogs to come out of the Nile River and invaded all the people. Frogs were everywhere, in their houses, in their streets, in their food, in their beds. Now, frogs were considered to be sacred or holy to the Egyptians, so they were not ever supposed to kill a frog. They worshipped a goddess of birth that had the head of a frog, and her name was Heket. But after a few days of this, Pharaoh called for Moses and begged him to get rid of these frogs. He told Moses he would let the people go out and worship God. Great, okay. So Moses asked God to get rid of the frogs, and God caused the frogs to die. And the people, there were so many of them that the people put them all and piled them in big piles outside, great big piles of frogs, and the whole place, it says the whole land was stinking from the frogs. So much for their frog god. But Pharaoh changed his mind, and he would not let the people go. So the Lord brought another plague on the land. Gnats, little biting insects, were everywhere. Some people say it might be mosquitoes or some kind of little swarming, biting insects that would make you itch and hurt. Aaron struck the ground with his staff, and all the dust of the ground turned into gnats. They covered the people and bit them and made them itch and were driving them crazy. So God used the gnats because they worshiped a god named Set, who was a god of the desert. And there's bugs like that in the desert. Now, some scholars say that the Hebrew word for gnats really means lice. It could be lice. Either way, that would be kind of nasty too. I wouldn't want those all over me either. But Pharaoh, even though he was very irritated and mad, he would not let the people go. The place where the Israelites lived was called the land of Goshen. Now, those first 3 plagues happened where the Pharaoh and the rest of the Egyptians lived, but also in the land of Goshen where the Israelites lived. But after those 3, they did not experience any more of the rest of the plagues. The next one was swarms of flies all over the land. Now, flies got in people's houses and in streets and everywhere around them, but not where the Israelites lived. God wanted them to know that he is the true God and he is powerful. The Egyptians had a fly god called Wachit. He was not any help to the people, as you can imagine. The flies were so thick that they could hardly see in front of their faces. They were like everywhere, and the people couldn't really do much of anything with all that going on. And I read that some of them might even have been the kind of flies that bite you. The Pharaoh, sick of this, told Moses he could go ahead and take the Israelites outside the land just a short distance to go worship their God. So God took the flies away. But then Pharaoh was stubborn again, and he changed his mind, and he wouldn't let the people go. So God brought the 5th plague. He caused the Egyptians' cattle and all kinds of livestock out in the fields, the horses, the camels, sheep, to get a disease and just die, drop dead. The Egyptians had at least 2 gods who looked like cattle. They worshipped cows. Later on, when they, in a time of sin, they actually would make a cow out of gold and start worshiping it. We called it the golden calf. You can read that in there too. And so they thought cows were sacred. And we know, of course, that their cattle gods did not protect them from being destroyed by the true God. None of the Israelites' cattle died. The Egyptian people were mad about all their animals dying, but Pharaoh was still stubborn and would not let the people go. So then God told Moses to get some soot from a kiln where they made bricks. And that's, the dusty, black dusty stuff when you have a fire going. And he told Moses to take some of that soot and just throw it up into the air. And everywhere that it landed, it caused the people to get on their skin, and it caused them to break out in these painful boils. Boils are like big sores that you can get on your skin. They're very painful, and they're not fun. And the people were all covered with these after having all the flies and the gnats and all that. Now the magicians of Pharaoh, which were kind of like their doctors, could not even stand before Pharaoh because they were in pain from these boils. That showed how little power they had. They did not have any power. They couldn't stop this. But Pharaoh would still not let the people go. So God told Moses to tell Pharaoh that all this time he's been bringing these horrible plagues on the Egyptians, he was being merciful because God could have killed all of them if he wanted to. But because he wanted Pharaoh and the Egyptians, plus all the other nations around them, to know that Yahweh is the only true God and he is powerful. And so therefore the next 3 plagues will be worse than the others. So the next plague that he sent was a horrible hailstorm, like no hail that there had ever been. Large hail and thunder and fire came down from the sky onto the earth. Some things I read said the hail could be as much as this big, like just big as like a shoebox or just great big. Moses, we're going to see in Exodus 9:23 through 26, it says this: Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, and the Lord sent thunder and hail and fire ran down to the earth. And the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. There was hail and fire flashing continually. In the midst of the hail, it was very severe, such as had not been in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. The hail struck all that was in the field through all the land, both man and beast. And the hails also struck every plant in the field and shattered every tree of their field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the sons of Israel were, there was no hail. So that sounds pretty scary, if you ask me. Some people say that the hail actually was like big chunks of hail with fire attached to it. Some people say that the fire was lightning. Either way, very scary. I wouldn't have wanted to go through that. And the 7th plague of hail attacked their sky goddess. They had a goddess of the sky named Nut and the storm god named Set. And neither of them could put a stop to that. Then Pharaoh told Moses that he had sinned and he believed that God is righteous. And if he will just stop this hail, he will let some of the Israelites leave. Just the men. He'll let the men go and worship their God and then come back. And Moses says, no, that's not going to work. God says, all the people go. The males, the females, the children, our cows, our goats, everything. So God brings the 8th plague on them, which is locusts. God caused locusts to fly into the land. You know what a locust is, right? It's a big, nasty looking bug. They're about this big, and they just eat and eat and eat and eat, and they just won't stop. They'll eat everything. God caused the locusts to fly onto the land and eat anything that was left after the hailstorm. More locusts than had ever been anywhere in the whole earth. Exodus 10:15 says, for they covered the surface of the whole land of Egypt, of course, so that the land was dark, and they ate every plant of the land and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left. Thus nothing green was left on tree or plant of the field throughout all the land of Egypt. That meant there would not be any crops at all left, and that meant there's not going to be any food for the people to eat, because they grew their oats and their barley and the things that they ate, and that was all destroyed. Now I'm sure that the Egyptians prayed to their god of crops, who was named Osiris, and that he the god of crops and harvest, to take these locusts away and save their crops. But Osiris did nothing, of course. Now Pharaoh was really getting mad. He acted like he was going to let the people go, but then he changed his mind after God took the locusts away. So the next plague, aimed at the sun god Ra, who was symbolized by Pharaoh himself, was complete darkness. If Pharaoh is the sun god Ra, then we're going to take the sun away. And so there was no sunshine, no daylight, no light. It was so dark that no one could see anything at all for 3 days. The Bible says it was a darkness that you could feel. It must have been very scary, especially for the children. I would have been petrified. And so their sun god was no help this time either. But there was light in the land of Goshen where the Israelites lived. Then after the 3 days of darkness, Pharaoh was really mad, but he still would not let them go. God told Moses he would bring the last plague. He would kill anyone who was a firstborn in all the land. This was a judgment against their god Isis, who was supposed to be the protector of children. Now God gave, and I said anyone in the land, it's the firstborn of all the males, male of cattle or humans or any male animal, but it was the males that killed. God gave special instructions to the Israelites so they would survive this plague. They were to kill a perfect lamb and put its blood on their doorposts and all over over the sides of the door of their houses. It looked like this. If I can hold this up where you can see it, let me see it right there. So that shows the blood across the top and on the doorposts on the sides. They were also told to roast a lamb and eat it along with unleavened bread that night. And it had to be a lamb that didn't have any blemish. In other words, it couldn't be a crippled lamb. It had to be a lamb that was just really a perfect little lamb. And they were told to eat that night along with unleavened bread because they didn't have time for the yeast to rise to make their nice loaves of bread. They had to just have flat bread. God said he would send a destroyer to kill the firstborn male of every household and every animal. This death angel would pass over any house that had the blood of the lamb on that doorpost. This was meant to be something that the Israelites would remember forever, and they would memorialize the Passover every year. And this is very important to God and his plan. So when the death angel went through the land, every family in Egypt had at least one person who died, even Pharaoh's own son. There was great sadness and anger and crying, and people were screaming. So Pharaoh finally told Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Get out. You know, we've had it with you people. And they left the next night. There were hundreds of thousands of them. After 430 years in slavery, they were finally free. And of course, we know that after they started out into the wilderness, Pharaoh changed his mind again. He was sorry he let them go. And he started chasing after him and his chariots and his armies. And God caused a miracle to happen by opening up the Red Sea and letting his people cross on dry ground. But when Pharaoh and his army chased them, the sea closed up and they all drowned. All these events brought down the great nation of Egypt and showed the power of the true God. And the fear of God and the knowledge of this God, of our God, spread through all the surrounding nations. The 10 plagues also showed the people of Egypt and the surrounding nations how their gods, put in quotes, were useless and had no power at all. God told the Israelites to remember the Passover and celebrate this time, and it's at this time of year that all this happened, that they came out of slavery through the mighty hand of God. Passover is a memorial of that night in ancient Egypt when God delivered his people from bondage, that's slavery, celebrated today by the Jewish people, but it's important for us Christians also. Before we come to know God, we are in slavery or bondage to sin in our lives. God allowed his son Jesus to be that perfect lamb that was killed as a sacrifice for our sins. When we accept his sacrifice for us, we become true Christians, and we become those Israelites of God, the spiritual Israelites of God. 1 Corinthians 5:7 tells us that Jesus became our Passover lamb when he was killed as a sacrifice to deliver all of us from the bondage of sin. And at this time of year, I like to reflect on these amazing events that happened thousands of years ago, but still have meaning to our Christian lives today.